Hello, my dear friends. Operator Starsky here with my good friend Jonathan Fink. Guys, first of all, as always, it's a big pleasure to see you with us tonight. And also, it's a big pleasure to see Jonathan here joining us from the UK. Jonathan, I think a lot of you know Jonathan's channel, Silicon Curtain. This man serves not only as a speaker delivering us the wisdom and experience from all kinds of great people. There's more than 800 videos on your channel right now, but also he serves as my personal inspiration for reasons I cannot really explain. So let's start with you. For those who don't know you, tell us a bit about yourself, please.
Oh well, that's the kindest introduction I think I've ever had, and I've had the huge pleasure, of course, meeting you in real life. But for operational security, I won't say when and I won't say where. We met in Germany, which was fantastic. I'm neither an academic nor a journalist, but I did study Russian as part of my degree, and in fact, I would call myself a keen Russia observer. Since about the age of, I know, I took an interest in Russia itself and its politics really from the age of about 16 onwards, but was reading the literature and translation from about 14. That's a considerable period. I calculated, it's more than 35 years. So it's quite a long time to be sort of, immersing in that. And maybe we'll come to the reasons afterwards, but I pretty much forgot my Russian language by about 2012. Then there was Bolotnaya, and I started taking a little bit of an interest once again in politics. And then there was 2016, and that's when things really, well, then there's 2014, of course, and the invasion of Crimea. And I started to kind of dusting it off, watching more news videos. And then in 2016, this became not just a little, hobby. This became a bit of an obsession because I felt that in 2016 we were already under attack. We were already subject to the so-called active measures, as they say, and nothing I've seen since has disabused me of that. And there's an advantage and a disadvantage, of course, speaking Russian. I see it as a distinct advantage at the moment because it really helps to understand what's being said and what maybe is coming next. And that's what I've been trying to do for the last 3 years is, consume as much material as I can in Russian language, use my understanding of Russian history, mindset, etc., and try to bring that to a English-speaking audience.
Absolutely. Knowing language is a weapon, actually. It's a good weapon because one reason why, for example, my channel reached the foreign audience outside Ukraine was literally because I was among few Ukrainians who spoke English, and I had a channel speaking about the war in Ukraine since the early days, not since the day one, but later, after a week. And actually, learning languages is so helpful that it's hard to explain how much it is important to know the language not only of your audience, but a language that, for example, you can use to interrogate prisoners. Of course, of course.
Because I haven't done that, I have to say. That's not part of my repertoire. But I do watch actually quite a few of the interviews of is it Zulkin? Is that the chap
Yeah.
who interviews POWs? I know Rick the Ukrainian does quite a few. He's translated quite a few or dubbed quite a few of those for Western audiences. But it's really quite not just disturbing, but it's quite eye opening. Listening
They're
to those
stunning.
conversations.
They're stunning.
Yeah.
Yeah. Jonathan, can you tell us a bit more about your channel? How did you come up with the idea of creating it? And what inspired you? What motivated you to do that?
So I have to say, I planned this, long before. So I actually registered the domain name for Silicon Curtain. I'd forgotten this completely, but I registered it in 2016, I think, or 2018. So it was quite a few years before the full-scale invasion. But throughout 2021, I had a sense that something big was coming. And I was like the ancient mariner, in the poem, sitting at the wedding, and I'm sitting in the park. People come and talk to me, and then I'll tell them that there's some doom on the horizon, right? You don't know what it is, but let me explain how Russia works, right? There's some doom coming our way, and I didn't know exactly what that was, although I felt it probably was going to be some kind of large-scale war. It wasn't clear in early 2021 whether it would exactly be Ukraine, although given the war had been going on for 8 years at that point, it seemed a good bet. But to my mind, it could have been Moldova. It could have been a full-scale absorption of Belarus. It could even be parts of Central Asia. I mean, who knows? But I felt that the regime was about to do something on a completely different scale because they were tightening the screws against dissidents, internal so-called opposition. They were trying to expel people from the country. And, they'd really been playing with these techniques. Well, first of all, they'd used Belarus as a kind of laboratory of increased authoritarianism, tweaking levers, seeing how far they could go. And if they needed to go all the way, obviously developing certain techniques to do it. So I, of course, watched that, the Belarus revolution absolutely intently. But throughout 2021, they were clearly experimenting, seeing how they could push further things. And I felt they were clearing the decks. Something was coming and they wanted to get people out of the way who were likely to be able to organize to object to it. And then, of course, when the intelligence information came out in late 2021, it started to become very clear that this was full-scale invasion of Ukraine. Now, I know a lot of experts said, no, of course, he won't do that because it's crazy, it's mad, it's whatever. Forgetting the number one rule, I think, of autocracy, and that is autocrats eventually, or maybe all the way through, but always eventually all autocrats make the most bizarre decisions based on the information bubbles they've built up, based on the sycophancy, based on the sort of almost the god delusions. They start to believe, they can control the skies and the seas and the very elements. They essentially become victims of their own sort of systems, their own network, and their own increasing paranoia. So this argument that he won't do it because it's irrational didn't cut any ice at all. I mean, look at the, I've traveled from one end of the country to the other in Russia and seen the lingering impacts of Stalinism. So I know that absurdity on a grand scale that chews up millions of lives is something perfectly possible in that place. So the channel actually happened because the rocket started to fall on was it 22nd of February 2024, and as they were falling, I joined Twitter. I started planning the channel out. I started making a list of guests and trying to figure out, how I'm going to actually do this thing. It took a couple of weeks to kind of get off the ground. And of course, you have sort of, I wouldn't say imposter syndrome, but you don't know how to go about these things. I'd never made a YouTube video. I'd never sat in front of the camera and recorded myself. So it took a while to get off the ground, but I was already planning it out all through that night, that sort of sleepless night while you guys were under missiles. I thought there's no way you can stay sane and just either watch this thing happening from afar and do nothing, or worse still, pretend it's not happening, and do the stuff, which fundamentally most people have carried on living their lives, unfortunately, in that way. And that film, Don't Look Up, it's felt very much like that. But Silicon Curtain, people have asked about the name as well. I mean, that's fairly basic. It's like the Iron Curtain. It's a new form of autocracy or totalitarianism descending on the world. The trouble is, this time it is not geographically bound. You couldn't draw it neatly on a map. Essentially, the Russian imperialism, the Russian BS exists wherever you have a device that contains a silicon chip. And I think that choice of name is really, it's been borne out as we see how Russia's hybrid operations penetrate everywhere, and especially, I would say, the US.
Yeah. You mentioned interesting thing about the tyrant's bubble. Do you think that they make decisions or take decisions based on their disconnection from the society. Does it benefit them, or does it introduce problems for the tyrants? If we're talking about Putin, for example.
I think it always introduces problems, but again, there's a point of difference, I think, between many societies, because you may have what's labelled sort of tyranny in many places, such as Iraq and all over, but they also feed off the sort of structures and conflicts and problems in their own society. So that's the point where my expertise starts to thin out, because I've observed one sort of tyranny and sort of partially observed Belarus as well, and of course kept an eye on Yanukovych, and come to understand that that was on a slide towards autocracy. So it's interesting seeing the mechanics of that. But of course, that was interrupted, that was stopped mid-process. We see it unfolding in Georgia. And through the course of all these interviews I've done, I've come to realize that there is a kind of toolkit. There is a series of transitional steps to autocracy, and there are a number of features of entrenched autocracies. But there's a lot of them, and not every dictatorship will use every single one of these transitional features, and not every single one will have the same sort of entrenched features either. Therefore, it's, I think, actually quite useful in looking at it as a kind of spectrum, as a set of features. And it's especially useful looking at the US in that sense, because you have to ask the question: at what point does a government become illegitimate? At what point has it broken the so-called electoral contract with the people and reneged on things that it promised to do? At what point is it functioning in the service of itself and not the country, or even worse, functioning in the service of a foreign power and not its own people and institutions? And I think if we just slap a single label on it, people can very easily say, well, that doesn't apply here, or we're not at that point yet. So I'm working on this sort of, I call it my dictators bingo card of transitional features and established features. So people can start sort of actually just saying, okay, well, we've hit that point, we've hit that, and we've hit that. And I think when they see the cumulative set of transitional points towards autocracy, then they'll kind of start to freak out. Because we've seen a number of academics. Now, Timothy Schreider hasn't been on my channel, but his wife, Marcy Shaw, has a couple of times. She is a phenomenal academic, also incredibly generous with her insights and her recommendations of, who else to interview and so on. And they're like the canary in the coal mine. They have actually left for Canada quite early on. We're only a couple of months into the Trump regime. And those who observe historical tyrannies and the mechanics of them are, I think, rightly, very scared. Autocrats will make mistakes. The question is, it's a scale of mistake. One could say that being an autocrat is already not in the interests of the majority of your people, and eventually it becomes not in the interests of your economy. Well, Russia hit that point a long time ago. One could say that from 2012 and the suppression of Bolotna onwards, the economic gains that were being made, at least in the big cities, started to roll back. The gains in life expectancy that were made compared to the 1990s, these started to roll back. Economic growth, innovation, all these things start to kind of grind to a halt. So already the autocrat is not working in the interests of the people and the country and its long-term future. But then it's a sliding scale. And, we see Putin, I think, moving dramatically down that scale, taking decisions that prolong his regime's longevity, that prolong his own life. But each of these measures comes at the cost of his country and its future opportunities, and people's generally the sort of people's way of life and quality of living. But as we approach, I would say, almost the end of his regime or the end of his life, then the costs of maintaining it become exponential. And I think we're in that kind of phase, and huge mistakes become an inevitable feature, I think, of that. Now, Stalin apparently, died quite peacefully, and the Second World War changed the trajectory of his regime. He couldn't, carry on liquidating everybody with a brain, because they'd be overrun by the Nazis. So there was some fundamental change in his regime. But he carried on, of course, I think 9 years after the war ended, and we saw the sort of some of those features of the 1930s starting to return back again. No, mistakes are inevitable. The question is, are those mistakes terminal for the regime and the country? Or in Putin's case, do they just carry on and carry on and carry on until the price becomes too high for the system to bear? We don't know how that's going to work out.
Absolutely. I think some of the mistakes that were made, they can only be recognized in a long-term perspective. For example, the Russian invasion of Ukraine, when Putin invaded thinking that he would take control over the whole country within like several weeks maybe,
Yeah.
and now we can see that Russia is slowly moving towards its inevitable demise. But today we talked in the interview on your channel about Trump, who doesn't recognize like signals coming from his own intelligence. And this is something that I am struggling to answer. I'm trying to find like an explanation why he ignores the facts delivered by his own intelligence, and he trusts whatever information like coming from, I don't know, Tucker Carlson or whatever. Is it because he also lives in his bubble, or maybe do you have some kind of explanation?
This is tricky, isn't it? Because if we compare Trump to Putin, you can guarantee that Putin does listen to and read, probably copiously, the intelligence briefings he gets. There is perhaps a systemic problem there in that they will be geared up to try and tell him what they think he wants to hear. So that's more of a sort of feedback loop error in his system. But the Putin regime takes a huge amount of polling data, even now. And one could say that part of the entire propagandistic network is not just used to get people to think a certain thing or behave a certain way, quite the opposite, actually. But it's there to test ideas. It's there to test the mood of people. So even though it's not a democracy, they do need some feedback mechanism. And it's my understanding from listening to various experts that he really does pay attention to this information. So that's interesting. He might not understand how a complex modern Western democracy works or why that might be of benefit, but I think he intrinsically understands the mechanics of his own system very, very well. And he understands how to pull the levers within that system. Trump is a different creature. He seems indifferent to the expertise and information that is at his fingertips. The US has got one of the largest and most sophisticated bureaucracies of any society in human history. It has certainly one of the largest intelligence services, and it's still packed with individuals who, more or less, are relatively competent at their tasks. The impression we get is that he doesn't listen to that stuff because he runs on his own instinct. He wants to do his own testing. And I think a lot of the sort of verbal salad that we see, a lot of the, we can do tariffs this week. No, we're not. Yes, we are. No, we're not. A lot of this sort of contradictory verbal stuff we see, one is to ensure that he floods the media space and crowds everything out. He has to absorb all the oxygen in the room. That's one thing. The other one, he's, I believe, constantly testing his messages. What works, what doesn't, who pushes back, who doesn't, how far can I go? How far can I go? And it's always that pushing and probing and pushing and probing. And what's he testing? He's testing the limits of American democracy, the limits of the checks and balances, the limits of partnerships to, curtail him in some way. So whereas Putin has deconstructed all those limitations against him, he has no need to play those kind of games because there's no internal, external opposition. He just has to figure how to thrash that system to get it to do what he wants. That's the eternal Russian problem, obviously. Trump, however, is dealing with a system that is still largely hostile to him, and he probably expected to meet far more hostility from it. So he's testing and probing to see how he can deconstruct the limitations that are placed on his power. Does he know what he will do when he gains that power? I kind of suspect that he doesn't really. It's a bit like the dog that chases the car. What's it going to do if it actually catches it one day? It has no clue what it's going to do with the car. And that feels like Trump. It's almost like a sort of psychopathic toddler constantly testing and pushing the rules to see what he can get away with before someone, slaps back, or he gets a smack from adults or something. Well, that's probably illegal these days. But you know what I mean? There's a certain instinct there on breaking the rules. Why? Because he understands that when you break the rules, that's how he's built his personal fortune. That's how he has built his infamy. And he's, I think, playing the game that he's always played.
That is, of course, a lot of interesting information to think about. Considering that he also mentioned that, for example, if he's elected, if he wants to be elected for the third time and things like that, and discussing whether J.D. Vance, for example, could get elected and then pass him the seat. But
Of course. How can anyone be any doubt that he wasn't going to do that? I mean, just in the same way that when Medvedev took over, I mean, to me and probably to you, it was so obvious what was happening, so clear and obvious, and yet there's this endless. I mean, this is the trick, of course, isn't it, of what's called the spin dictatorship or hybrid dictatorship. You create the illusion of institutions, you create the illusion of plurality, you create the illusion that there's some kind of uncertainty. Oh, who's going to win the election? We don't really know. Yeah, I mean, come on, everything is predetermined, and Putin would never call an election unless he could guarantee the outcome of that process. And I think that's something perhaps Trump aspires to be able to do, to exercise that level of control and certainty over the political environment. But he's not there yet. He's still quite a long way from being able to do that.
yeah, and for example, that is why in Russia there is no presidential election. There's election of Putin. This is how they usually refer to this process. But Jonathan, you have an extraordinary experience of living and studying in Russia. What was the craziest thing about being there?
Every day, every day you'd wake up. And this is the 90s. And I know that certainly I've spoken to people who, started studying and working in the early 2000s. And then things calmed down a little bit, at least in the capitals. But at the time I was there, you would wake up and you would not know what was going to happen to you that day. You would have no clue. And it could be the bizarrest things. You don't know who you're going to meet, what's going to happen. And so there was a certain, I would say, spontaneity to it that was something of an adventure, it has to be said. And you did get the sense that you were inhabiting the sort of carcass of a huge beast that has expired. I traveled quite a lot, which was, I guess, a lot of people took the chance to travel, but I did quite a bit of that. So I went down to Uzbekistan from Moscow, which was a sort of what was that? So I guess that's a 3-day, 2-night sort of train journey. I went up to Murmansk in the far north, so we could take pictures of the nuclear fleet. Can't do that now. That's a sort of 2-day, 1-night sort of train journey. And then I went to, obviously traveled all over, the north and the east in the sort of, in St. Petersburg kind of area, and visited all of the sort of Golden Ring cities and so on, but also traveled out to Irkutsk, which would be a five-day sort of train ride. So yeah, I got to see quite a bit, I would say. And of course, I worked for a while there. So the first visit was 92. And the last major visit was 98, so sort of pre-Putin. I went 1 or 2 times on more sort of, tourist type trips after that. Not that I ever described Russia as a holiday. But really, it spanned that period of 92 to 98, which was critical because in 92, it was in between Gorbachev being essentially ejected from power and the collapse of the Soviet Union in 1991. And then 1993, Yeltsin shelled the White House building. I already had friends living in Moscow who were giving me running commentaries, saying they were seeing, corpses in the parks outside their flats and apartments. And, so that was an incredibly dramatic time. And the summer of 92, when I went there, was the first summer where the real market reforms kicked in. The shops were still empty. Lenin was still on the currency for a couple of weeks more. And you had some private shops opening up. But generally, you just had people on street corners sort of selling stuff. The city, Moscow, was pretty empty in the summer of 92 because people didn't know if they were going to get paid or if there was going to be food in the shops in the winter. So everyone in that summer, and it was a particularly hot one, they decamped to their dachas so they could grow food and create pickles just in case. Who knows what's going to happen? It could be a coup, it could be this, it could be that. People just wanted to stock up with enough food if they had access to land in order to be able to sort of survive through the winter. So that was pretty dramatic. And then in 1998, when I left, it was at the height of the financial crisis. With hyperinflation had been going for some time, but that's when they had the major currency devaluation. And that was kind of interesting as well, because all the warehouses closed their doors, the shops very quickly emptied. There was almost nothing left to buy. I panicked. I ran out and I bought several tins of caviar and some large salamis and champagne. And for a few days, we lived off that. It was very tough.
How do you recognize a Brit in Russia easily? But this is crazy, Jonathan. You're talking about things that happened in 1993.
Yes.
Not a lot of people realize actually that 1993, that is literally 2 years since the collapse of the Soviet Union, Russia already participated in 3 wars.
Yes.
Which was Transnistria, Pridnestrovia, which was Abkhazia, the Georgian region, and the war in Chechnya started.
Absolutely. And, the war in Chechnya, as we know, isn't just an insurgency. It's partly, as we see the subsequent wars in Georgia and Donbass, it is stoked by, GRU agents and assets to create an excuse, to create a provocation. The first Chechen War, yes, they did want independence, like other territories again, independence in the Baltics and so on. But the second Chechen War essentially was entirely engineered to consolidate Putin's power and smooth his rise in. And I think this is the key thing. Putin is the one who's associated with authoritarian methods. But already when I was out there in 97, 91, 95, and then 96, 97, I saw a number of things which meant that what happened in the full-scale war and the sort of mobilization came as no surprise. People are shocked and like, how on earth can this happen in the 21st century? No, it already happened on a different scale in the 1990s. So I remember already in 97, we used to go to something called the British Council. So it's obviously sort of soft power, it's sort of outreach, cultural centre that the British have, and they were opened up very shortly after permission was given for those, and you could go in, you could rent videos, and Russian teachers of English could go in and access resources. They started persecuting it in 1997. They started following the staff and giving threats and putting dummy bombs under their cars.
In
and
1997.
97. And then they started curtailing their activities, so reducing down, their impact on the cultural life of the city. So these elements were already starting to coalesce and happen. Another one, which was people being, I can't remember the exact year, but I remember it very distinctly, going down to one of the deep metro stations, which is at a place called Sena Ploshad, or the sort of Haymarket. And it's one of these deep stations with 2 entrances, a very long concourse. So you have escalators at each end, but there's only one entry and exit. There's no sort of perisadka. There's no sort of other route out. And they're already trying to look for people for their army, for to send to Chechnya. So we come down to the station, and they slow the escalators down, and we're like, that's kind of odd. And then they stop them, so we have to walk down physically. And these tunnels are quite deep, if anyone's ever been there. And they're checking people's papers as you come down off the escalator. Trains are coming in and disgorging people onto the platform, and they're not allowed out of the station until their papers are checked. You know, are you military age? Have you served? Have you got exemption? If you didn't have those papers with you, and it didn't matter if you said, oh, I've got them at home, just let me go home and get them. No, they were already being hauled off into vans, sent to frontline bases, or not frontline bases, but they'd be sent to training bases, and from thence onto the front. And this is in St. Petersburg, people of student age being hauled off the streets to go and serve. So the brutality, the inhumanity, yeah, not in the least surprising, unfortunately. It never went away.
It's crazy. When you were in Russia, what was the first thing that made you realize how deeply controlled the society is?
Of course, in the 90s, this is interesting to say, it wasn't. The central power had essentially collapsed. The state withdrew from people's lives for a handful of years. And what I mean withdrew, I mean it really did withdraw. I mean, people generally were not being monitored. In the student halls, I was pretty sure there were a few agents placed to try and sort of scout out students. So that was still going on. But generally speaking, you did not get the impression that people were being surveilled. And I think there was a certain, certainly people who were older, there was a certain caution, but people who were younger, in their teens, 20s, I think were pretty open in expressing themselves and saying what they wanted. I mean, those people who were interested in literature were gorging themselves on books that have been banned for generations, on movies and music. So there was a sort of cultural explosion. There was also a lot of documentary films about the Stalin period. And there was an opening up of information and discussion about what had happened. Now, at some point, that gets a bit much. And rather than facing it, it's easier to say, okay, well, yeah, we know everything now, and we've done that. Thank you very much. You can stop talking about the past. So obviously a blanket of amnesia is placed over that. But from about sort of 92, I would say, through to about sort of 97, 98, I did not get the sense of widespread surveillance. I did not get the sense that the state was really trying to tell people what to think or what to do. You had TV networks like NTV and satirical programs such as Kukli that were viciously parodying the government and politicians. And they hated it, but it was sort of tolerated. Again, in hindsight, one would have thought tolerated because you're moving us to a pluralistic society. I think in hindsight, I realized it was tolerated and the state wasn't interfering in people's lives in the same way, simply because it didn't have the power to do so. So where did it go? Where did this huge KGB infrastructure go? Well, first of all, the people who inhabited it were busy trying to make money, because without money, you didn't have an awful lot of power at the time. Subsequently, that's flipped back to the traditional Russian thing, which is you accrue money if you have power. It's a totally opposite dynamic than it is in the West. And that's the one difference between Putin and Trump. Trump and his acolytes still believe that the acquisition of money, or the perception of having a lot of money, equals power. And actually that dynamic pretty much works in the West. Doesn't matter whether it's acquired, corruptly or not. You still need money to exercise power. Not at all how it works, obviously, in Putin-esque Russia. You have networks, you have power, you have the willingness to project violence and authority. You find your way in the vertical system, and then money is there. Money is one of the benefits or status symbols of your role in the power vertical. But at that point, it was starting to resemble the West, which is without money, you don't have any power or status. But also those who were, I think, in that sort of, KGB type system, they were busy trying to figure out how they could absorb the mafia. And this wasn't a mafia that had just emerged suddenly in the 1990s. This was the old Soviet mafia that suddenly, the limit was lifted on how much they could earn. The limits were lifted on, how deeply they could penetrate society. So you had all sorts of gangs, all sorts of mafia. But I think at that point, the energies of the state were busy trying to merge with this criminal underclass, and they kind of left people alone to do their thing. By the end of the 1990s, of course, that process was complete, and there'd been a sort of hybridization of the mafia and the KGB class. Then they were ready to start taking over society again, and all the levers of state. And then once they'd achieved that, after Bologna in 2012 failed, then I think, and this very much reflects the Stalinist period as well, once you've achieved your internal consolidations, then you can start meddling in global affairs and export those same methods.
A lot of people, unfortunately, think that there is some kind of way to talk to Putin through words, through communication, which, guys, mafia of the 80s and early 90s in Russia and generally on the post-Soviet space is literally those old thugs who would have their enforcers from gyms, the boxers, the wrestlers, and they would literally go racketeering the area and extorting things, extorting businesses and things like that. And sometimes, of course, because there were a lot of people who wanted to acquire some goods, right, some property, they would sometimes fight each other. And Russia in the late 80s, early 90s was pretty much the same as Chicago in the 30s and 40s. Was pretty much the same, with the only difference that in Russia, the mafia didn't really respect life at all. So they would kill families, shoot wives, kidnap kids and dismantle them and then send their fingers to their parents and things like that, and put a lot of people on the construction sites into the concrete. And those people in Russia today are basically Russian government, Russian elite, and Russian oligarchs, and Putin himself. Putin is the one who exports violence to places like Syria, to places like Ukraine. Basically, he does the same what they did back in those days, only on a larger scale. And unfortunately, the only language, I don't know if you agree with me, but the only language that mafiosi like Putin understand is also the language of violence. Until he receives fingers of his kids, he will not consider you a proper person to speak to. That is just my opinion.
Well, this is it. I mean, actions count for everything, words count for nothing. Words, in fact, are a sign of weakness in that culture. And I think this is the problem of Western diplomacy towards Russia throughout this period, and including the full-scale war. And it's one of the problems with, I think, some of Trump's team, or at least we don't know whether this is just something that's been done as a kind of fig leaf, as a smoke and mirrors, to keep the media happy. This constant puppetry of so-called negotiations. I rather suspect there's much more of a mafia dynamic going on behind the scenes between Trump and Putin, unfortunately. But if you hope to convince them with words, with treaties, any kind of default or to values of any sort, none of these things cut any ice. They're entirely meaningless. The only person who understands this dynamic seems to be Erdogan. When Russian airplanes violated Turkish airspace, they were given a warning. They ignored the warning. They were shot down, and it didn't happen again. So that is the language, not the language of what is it called, escalation management. No, you hit them hard. You hit them in a way they don't suspect, so they don't see it coming. Then you've got them on edge. Then they're like, oh, okay, I don't know what this person's going to do, but they've shown the willingness to use force. I mean, that's why I think when Sweden and Finland joined NATO, there was lots of fuss until they did. And then once they did, there was no fuss at all because they took a decisive action to deter Russia. And that's simply the way you have to operate with them. Massive force, massive deterrence. By all means, signal that we're not interested in occupying their swamp. They can happily keep that swamp to themselves. But these are our rules. This is our territory, and they will not touch it. I think the French almost certainly have the right idea in making sure that Putin's puppets can't dismantle their system. Romania has the right idea that when there is evidence, demonstrable evidence of interference, that breaks your constitution, you deal with it, and you deal with it in an uncompromising way. The US, of course, had copious evidence of Trump's malfeasance and decided that he was too powerful to do anything about it. And this is the consequence. Yeah, I mean, what can you say with these guys? Don't do business. Don't take their money. Don't sell them houses in your neighborhood. Don't let them into your schools because all these institutions will become corrupted. And Britain, of course, is one of the worst offenders through Londongrad of enabling Russian oligarch money to permeate into our system.
Yeah, that's so crazy. Unfortunately, the threat is much deeper than that, than just ignoring Russians, ignoring their business, ignoring cooperation or like partnership with them. It doesn't necessarily isolate you from being recruited, because unfortunately FSB is extremely good at this through different tools. And by the way, when you were in Russia, was there a moment when you realized that you better get out of there?
Yes, 98. 98, in the financial crisis. And I've spoken to a couple of people who were there at the time. And I said that my recollection is of feeling quite anxious because a few people who I knew, teachers and people who were working, were mugged. So there was an uptick in criminality. There was a certain desperation for a while until the economy stabilized. But the thing that disturbed me was, and this is what I said to people, look, they said, well, and this happened in the early 2000s as well. Well, come back. You can make a fortune here. And I'd say to them, look, I like my kneecaps. I like my body parts. And I could work my butt off, and earn a fortune, but someone will come along and take it off you. Some official will come along and take it off you. And the entire reality of that will be completely distorted through lies and propaganda. They're like, oh, what are you talking about? And unfortunately, that cynicism that I always had really since living there is maintained. I had a sense that there was no independent court, there was no rule of law, there was no redress to the law, that the deeper your pockets were, the more the judicial system would bend towards you. But ultimately, in the vertical system, if you come across somebody who's higher than you in the pecking order, there is no defense against that. It's just you're lower down the food chain than they are. Tough luck. The other aspect of it was that a lot of deeply offensive anti-Semitic graffiti appeared and posters and so on all over. Now, there'd been through Zhirinovsky's party and this appalling kind of daily newspaper called Dien. There'd been a sort of strong undercurrent of anti-Semitism and racism. Homophobia, for some reason, not really a big thing at that point, and no one seemed to care too much about that. But certainly, the anti-Semitism already was a virulent undercurrent in society, and even a lot of people who wouldn't have thought of themselves as anti-Semites would drop some pretty appalling, phrases into their common speech, not necessarily even realizing what they were saying was deeply offensive. But it was the uptick in that. It just felt very unclean. I thought, well, okay, with a bit of pressure, as soon as you apply a bit of pressure to this society, it's like it's like some kind of diseased piece of skin. You press it a bit, and all the pus comes out. Well,
Yeah.
that's kind of been shown to be an absolutely correct assumption, unfortunately, as well.
One thing I noticed when I was a bit younger, it's like late 90s, early 2000s in Ukraine, um, a lot of far right guys in Ukraine. We didn't have a lot of them, but I'm talking about those that we had. We had movements like Blood and Honor. They also existed in Russia. There were like different chapters of those. And I know that those far right guys that I knew in Ukraine, they were all looking at the far right guys in Russia as their like role models, because the far right movements, and I'm talking about like neo-Nazi movements in Russia, the white power skinheads, they were extremely strong, especially if we're talking about early 2000s. I remember everybody in Ukraine, those guys that saw themselves like joining this amazing movement, they were like sharing videos of Tisak, those the dude went to prison for a murder, I think, and they were like sharing 99% of the content coming from Russia, because in Russia it was extremely developed, and later from Russia it started moving slowly towards Ukraine. We had a lot of different movements, like pan-Slavic movements, that had their roots in Russia, and then they tried to spread their um, influence to Ukraine as well. Do you think they were also controlled by FSB? Because if we're talking about or all kinds of marginal movements, it doesn't matter if they're far left, far right. If you're talking to a representative of any uh, intelligence service of a European country, they will tell you that scratch far left, scratch far right in Europe anywhere, and you will see a bunch of rubles. How do you think,
Yes,
is it true?
I think it is certainly now true, and I think it's. I think the measure of it is those that consistently repeat Russian propaganda narratives, despite the evidence, and occasionally in the face of even the groups they're part of. Tucker Carlson says stuff which actually some of his audience won't even agree with, and you think, okay, well that's definitely something behind that, because it's just not normal to so consistently flat reality and parrot these things. But unfortunately, I suspect that these are not entirely seeded by the FSB. I think a lot of these organizations actually, unfortunately, would have sort of organic origins. Um, but very quickly, they'll see there's some benefit, there's some grift, there's some power to be had in these kind of extreme views. And they'll coalesce into a certain identity, or they'll be encouraged to start coalescing around a sort of more fixed identity. I think what the Russian security service has always done is placed agents within these groups to understand them, to understand their dynamics, how powerful they are, who's part of it, whose voices are listened to, whose aren't, so that they can actually coerce them at some point. So that doesn't mean they are controlling them all the time or right from the very beginning. But what they don't want is sort of powerful organic movements springing up, which they don't have the ability to coerce or which they don't know too much about. That's certainly intolerable for a regime like Putin's. But unfortunately, I think a lot of this, it becomes difficult to say where it comes from, because ultimately you've got decades and decades of toxic Soviet indoctrination. You've got because of the lack of freedom, I think you have a society which is more prone to conspiracy thinking or conspiratorial thinking. But why would that be? It's because every newspaper you've read throughout your life turns out to be lying to you. The ideology that you pumped into your schools turns out to be absolute nonsense, although many people suspect it for a while. When every aspect of your reality turns out to have been, a massive whopping great lie intentionally told to you, um, either when you're still in that process of following it, you will start to develop a more anecdotal way of looking at reality. You will share information with people who are close to you or share a similar mindset. You might even start cherry picking parts of history that create a more coherent picture of reality for you. And I think that the history of the 90s in Russia is this, you know, is people sort of discovering how far their reality had been hacked. And discovering that there's a lot of other stuff out there in the world, but trying to find some kind of certainty, some anchor, but experimenting with different ideas, experimenting with different identities. But at some point where the state becomes powerful, it's got all these different experiments going on. It can pick and choose, well, which ones are going to be most effective for our purposes. It's a little bit like, those who codified the Bible. I would say, without being an expert on that either, you have all these multiple books and versions and stories and conflicts between them. You're like, okay, if we're going to build a coherent religion out of this, if we're going to build a story that actually, has real power behind it, then you can't have all these paradoxes. We're going to have to winnow this down into identities and groups that we can actually control. What you have now, of course, I think, is that there's almost no organic behavior whatsoever. So every NGO, every organization, every party, every pop star, every film, every bit of media, it's all a product. It's all in some way tainted by regime control, even if that's only 1%, 2%, 5%, whatever. There's no authenticity behind anything.
Oh, you told me about the experiments, and I suddenly realized that there were so many experiments shown on the Russian TV, because of course in Ukraine we watched Russian TV, and specifically in the TV shows about aliens and paranormal activities and things like that. I was a little kid back then. I was something like 10 plus, but from those amazing experiments on the Russian TV, I learned, for example, that there are 4 primary races of the alien creatures from outer space. I even remember like the machines they fly and how to tell which one is which. There are like, oh my God, this amazing Russian TV, like late and middle 90s. It was insane.
All the psychic stuff as well. I remember all the psychic stuff was just like, oh my goodness, this is absolute nonsense. I remember the look in people's eyes as well. It doesn't even have to be sort of off the scale kind of lunacy. And they'd ask me, we'd be talking about this and that. We talk about literature, and they'd be like, oh, and you could see that warming to you. And then they'd say something, about your, religious belief, and you'd explain that actually, with Protestant, Catholic, and Jewish elements to my family. I mean, what else could I be except atheist? So, and then they look at you like, oh, deep sort of horror and shock. But even if you didn't, there was this extraordinary view that somehow your soul is different anyway. Even if you're a believer, it's not the same kind of soul, and you're not going to end up in a good place. And there was a certain pity. I remember a certain pity among some people when they talked to you about that, which I found deeply weird.
What do you think about the Russian church? Did you have any experience of visiting those amazing sites in Russia?
Oh my God, yes. I'll tell a couple of stories there, because I was about to tell one of those stories. The other thing I learned there is that there's no such thing as accidents. There's nothing accidental. Like, you could go out every day and you don't know what's going to happen to you. But when it comes to power and money, there's no accidents that occur anywhere. So even though you come to it and the road's full of potholes and the society looks pretty chaotic, and you think this place is chaos, it's the complete opposite of chaos. It's structured so that some people benefit. It's never majority, but someone always benefits from the state of chaos that you see. And that was a curious insight, and it really hit me, because a friend of mine was a frontline doctor for homeless children. Now, many of these children obviously were, used for prostitution and drugs and so on. Children as young as 5, think he was dealing with. He would deal with children who were 8, 9, 10, who were ending up in Kresty, if you know the Kresty Tsarist prison in St. Petersburg. You can imagine children being locked in that place. And he would, he'd deal with their wounds and so on, and he listened to their stories. So he kind of knew some of these sort of weird things in society, and he showed me a lot of weird stuff as well. You don't want to go drinking with him because you always take your life in your hands. You never knew where the hell you're going to end up with him. But we went to a church, and he said, "Look, this looks like chaos, doesn't it? Because there were beggars everywhere, all the way out on the street and up and inside, and you couldn't get away without being they were badgering you and so on." He says, "This looks like chaos, doesn't it?" He says, "No, let me explain the order here." And he explained it in a way that it's almost like a sort of mathematics, like a 3D model, in that you know where in the church you can harvest the most donations. So you had a beggars mafia, and he explained to me, the hierarchy of beggars, and it's not accidental that that one is there. That's because he has a better krisha or roof, and he pays more if he's cut to somebody else. And it's like, even in what looks like this sort of chaotic situation, there's an extraordinary order in which somebody is creaming money off, somebody is benefiting. And then suddenly I started to look at the whole of society in that way. It's like, okay, and ask the question, wherever you see chaos, who benefits? Who benefits from this? Follow the money. And that I think that simple philosophy is kind of quite useful at the moment as well. But no, I found the church sort of curious. I'm sure there are a lot of people who entered it out of a belief in a certain set of values, but already, got the impression that certainly it was a magnet for people with a certainly nationalistic frame of mind. They were already starting to rebuild the Храм Христос Спасителя in Moscow, which is this, if people don't know, it's this huge cathedral that was built in the 1870s, I think, to celebrate the victory over Napoleon. And it's this extraordinarily vast, let's get slightly vulgar. I mean, it's okay, but it's not the most beautiful church. But it's this huge, great marble and gold edifice. And then Stalin filled it with dynamite, not personally, but on Stalin's order, it was filled with hundreds of tons of TNT, and it was blown to smithereens in the 1930s. And in the 1990s, they started to rebuild it. And I found that an extraordinary process. But it was rebuilt, I think, in a far more vulgar way than the original even. And it was built very much as a cathedral of the oligarchs. And if you'd contributed, and if you were part of that vertical structure, you had privileged access to the interior of it. Again, this is all pre-Putin. This system is already, taking shape. He just has to come in and tweak it a bit. But I found that extraordinary because you compare that to what was going on in little villages, because people were coming together and getting churches rebuilt in villages as well. That's much more of a communal thing. Or you'd have a rich local business person maybe and the community chipping in. That's maybe a much more interesting process. But even there, it was curious because the particular village, I won't say my connection to it, but we went year after year. And the first year I went, it was just a pile of bricks, basically. It was a pile of bricks and an old cemetery that was completely run down. It had been used for target practice by communists in the 1930s. And then the Soviets, because the village had been occupied by the Germans, it was on the edge of Novgorod, which is great, Novgorod the Great, Veliky Novgorod. And so the Germans occupied the outlying villages, and they were shelling the centre of town. And then the Soviets were using the spire of this church to calibrate their artillery to hit the Germans in the village. So it was kind of reduced to absolute rubble. But they started to rebuild it, and it was sort of 18th century, sort of very subtle village Baroque kind of style. Very, very pretty little church, actually. And one summer the structure was finished, and the next
Uh,
summer they. Oh,
yeah,
hello, am I
I,
still
I
here?
just wanted to interrupt you just for a second because Jake Bro is in the chat. Hello, Jake. It's a great opportunity to pass you greetings from your two dedicated fans. Nice to see you here.
That's
Yeah, Jonathan.
fantastic
So,
knowing Jake's there. And then another summer they'd gilded the cupola, and then the next summer, they'd put the whitewash on the walls ready for the frescoes. And then the last summer, I think it was in '98, I went there the last time, and they'd already started painting the frescoes on the inside and the outside. And that was kind of extraordinary. And if you see in the film Andrei Rublev, Tarkovsky film, it had echoes of that. It's extraordinary kind of experience there. And the workers were really busy, painting away, but they weren't ethnic Russian. And I asked some of the villagers, who are these guys? Oh, that one's from Uzbekistan, that one's from Kazakhstan. And I'm like, excuse me? Like, don't you have, ethnic Russian, mastery or, experts in this? No, no, no. He said, well, Russians will drink. They won't turn up and do the job. No, all of this renovation and construction. This is all everyone's from Central Asia. Everyone who does the actual work, who has any expertise, rebuilding this Christianity in Russia. A big part of it was done by labor that's non-ethnic Russian, and that I think is the essence of it. No matter what intention is behind rebuilding it, and no matter what the community contributed to it, they're not doing the hard work of actually constructing it themselves. And then when this edifice is built, what happens? The state coerces it. It uses the power that this institution has created to pervert society, to train society as a weapon, to turn that weapon on its neighbors. So that's the conundrum, I think. Here you can have all sorts of things happening at a sort of community level or whatever. You can have all sorts of groups and experiments, whether you like their ideologies or not. But at some point, everything gets turned into a weapon. So people need to bear this in mind. If they are looking to lift sanctions against Russia, if they are looking to normalize Russia, until you deconstruct the entire vertical power system, it will always revert to its militaristic phase. Once it's recharged its batteries, it will always pervert whatever institutions get built up and turn them into weapons.
and you mentioned people from the Central Asia doing things. This is something that we talked today with you. A lot of conservatives, for example, on the West, they have problem with, for instance, Muslim people, right? And they consider like running to Russia because Russia always positions itself, Russian propagandists position Russia as this conservative land populated by white people with blue eyes. All of them are like conservative Christians, and some naive people actually do that. They actually like sell their property in Canada or United States and they travel to Russia, only to realize that according to statistics of 2024, every 10th person in the terrorist federation is actually a Muslim, but also in Moscow it's 1 in 5 people is Muslim. If you don't trust me, check out this beautiful celebration of the Ramadan on Sunday. Muslim people around the world were celebrating the holy month, and I know because I live with one. And basically, you can check out the footage from the Moscow downtown with thousands and thousands of Muslim people celebrating, and those conservatives from the West, after selling all of their stuff, because like it's a real story. We know this family from Canada that was so much abused from living, in a society, in such a liberal society full of gays and Muslims, that they ran to Russia, only to realize that, you did a mistake. Jonathan, I wanted to talk to you about your channel, but before that, I'm curious, did you ever talk to somebody who developed or spread disinformation for Russia. Do you have such experience?
No, well, what I had was I had a little notebook, and I'd collect what I started to consider to be historical mythologies. These are little phrases or little ideas or little sort of verbal memes, as it were, that help people to explain the world around them. I started to collect them because it seemed to me that we have them in all societies. We have certain beliefs and prejudices, but there seemed to be a sort of a consistency in the telling of these narratives, and using similar phraseology, similar kind of images, mental images as well. So I thought, this feels a bit odd, to hear people saying things that are clearly, which is wrong, not always sort of racist and so on, but just ideas that don't make much sense. But to hear them so consistently from multiple people, that's I started to feel that was very, very weird. So I had my little notebook of historical mythology, and of course, what we find in Putin's regime, what had been a collection of ideas that some of them were sort of organically created, some of them are actually adaptations of the sort of Soviet mythologies, or even just the mythologies of empire. This is something Putin was able to tap into. He didn't invent any of these things; they were already there. It was already a rich soil of this sort of political and historical mythologizing. So I found that kind of really weird. The only point where I started to notice anything specific was around, of course, the time that Skripal was killed, and of course prior to that, Litvinenko, because I posted some stuff on social media and then got some rather odd replies. And I got people latching onto me, trying to engage me in debate, trying to send me publications and links and this and that and the other. And that again, that was quite clearly, it's quite clear what was kind of going on. But what stunned me was the scale of resource that it must take. I'm just one person posting this, and you tot up all the hours and resource that someone's paying for to try to either neuter me or persuade me of a different point of view. I just found that extraordinary. Obviously, we're going back a few years prior to COVID and stuff. I did also get a rather curious offer from someone I hadn't spoken to a long time to set up a joint business and bring Russian tourists to Oxford to enjoy the lovely spires of cathedrals, like in Salisbury. And I jokingly went along with it for a couple of days because this is hilarious. This could be the basis of an Armando Iannucci film script. I said, what are we going to call it? Cathedral tours or something? Showing KGB agents around British provincial cities. But no, I mean, obviously that wasn't going to happen, and I wasn't going to get involved in that. I in my channel, I've tried to avoid. I mean, people might say this is kind of weak, but I tend to have a certain view of what's going on, and I'll tend to invite speakers on who more or less fit with broadly speaking, that version of reality. Obviously, there's a wide diversity of people, but I don't invite anybody in who has either knowingly or unknowingly, regurgitated chunks of propagandistic narrative. That doesn't mean they'll all agree with the same versions of reality. It doesn't mean they won't be subject to, false ideas or false impressions. But that's fine. That's just part of normal, I would say, historical debate and conversation. But no, up until now, I have not debated propagandists. I have not felt it was useful. But you and I have had this conversation. We won't say, any individuals' names, but there are some people who have been inside the Russian propaganda machine, and at this point in time are opposed to the regime. It may be useful to have I would call it a challenging conversation with people who have indulged in the propagandistic arts, as it were. But I mean, the jury's still out on that one, and the people I've asked, like yourself and others, are split pretty much But at the moment, on the particular individuals we're talking about, they're pretty much split about 60% against, 40% saying yes, but you know, proceed with extreme caution and find the right format to do it in. I've had a few people saying, do you know what? I don't think you should do it, but I definitely listened to that interview. So that's another. Yeah. I don't know. I don't know if it provides benefit. I mean, one person who's busy doing this is Joseph Lindsley. He's going in and he's debating people who are knowingly or unknowingly propagandists. He's going into the right wing media bubble and he's just getting to grips with that because he knows a lot of that language. He sympathizes with a lot of the policies actually that are prevalent in that community. So he's maybe better equipped to do that. I don't know if it provides efficacy. What about you? I'm sure you've in Ukraine met with a lot more people who you suspect might be assets or agents of Kremlin influence.
2012, I went to Moscow to attend the big communication workshop that involved communication specialists from like Sberbank, Russian media, Russian radio. Literally 2 days spent at that communication conference. Literally nothing to talk about because I worked by that time approximately 6 years in communications in Ukraine. I don't really think that I learned anything new. Yeah, but one thing I learned is that prices in Moscow are insane and people look so grumpy for no reason at all. I don't know. There are several people who actually know how this works. I worked with a guy who worked as a polittechnolog, political technologist. Yeah, in Russia. So we spoke about developing and implementing communication strategies. But again, Russian problem was that Russians always perceived Ukrainians as Russians. Like to them, we were basically like an offspring or whatever of this big Russian empire, younger brother, and they always considered us like them, because they occupied Ukraine for 70 years, even more actually. And this was their biggest mistake because Ukraine has its own features. It has Ukrainians have a lot of traits that are only typical for Ukrainians. Russians don't have that. Ukrainians are less atrocious, of course, and we have this culture of we had this culture of retransmitting violence like Russians do, but we have this culture coming from the 90s from Russia. And I believe early and middle 2000s, we got rid of it because we had a lot of Russian shows promoting Russian prison culture, which was extremely popular, and I think it still is there. In Ukraine, not so much. In Ukraine, it's basically so much despised by Ukrainian younger populations. We don't have that anymore. We don't see our future built on violence like Russians do. And that is one of the fundamental differences between Ukrainians and Russians. They always considered us like Russians only like Untermenschen, right? And this probably was the foundation of their failure in 2022. I think so, because their communication strategies didn't work well on Ukraine. They did well in terms of sowing discord, which doesn't require a lot of talent, actually. But if you're talking about communications, which is something that creates instead of destroying, didn't work here. Didn't work at all. even though they had a lot of ethnic Ukrainians there in Russia also working in communications, but they failed. But speaking of communications, which speakers do you enjoy having on your channel the most, and why?
Oh, well, I mean, the present company, of course. Um, so no, but genuinely, conversations with you, with Anna, and there are a handful of lovely Ukrainians who I find those conversations endlessly stimulating because I'm learning at the same time, and I think that's sort of super important. And I'm all about constantly being challenged and having my ideas challenged, and that happens with you guys a lot. So those are fantastic conversations. I also like the fact that there's a sort of community aspect to it. I can not have to put on that sort of slightly stiff, interviewer kind of persona. Conversations with Jake and Konstantin are absolutely fantastic. I also know they're going to, these conversations are all going to hit big audiences. That is part of the dynamic as well. You want to be able to get information to as many people as possible. You want to change minds and stiffen resolve to support Ukraine. So for as far as impact goes, again, I enjoy conversations where I know they're going to have really big impact because of quality of information and the reach they're going to have as well. Of course, the conversation with Ben Hodges are an enormous privilege, every time. I know that a lot of policymakers will listen to those. I know a lot of people who then are either in the armed forces or the sort of foreign policy analyst community are going to tune in, and that we're helping to sort of shape ideas and again harden the ideas around how people perceive Russia, and not inject their own distorted sort of Western frameworks into that. So those I find incredibly important. Some of the best interviews are actually with unknown people. Those are people who, I've read some interesting stuff they've posted. I might have seen little snatches of a short interview they did somewhere else on CNN or whatever. And I'm thinking, do you know what? I mean, they're only given like 15 seconds there, but that grabbed my attention. What could we do over a whole hour? What is there to discover? So some of the best conversations have been with Ukrainians who people may not have heard of outside the country, or even sometimes inside the country may not have heard of them, but they are, I would say, consummate experts in their own right, and almost all of them have been passionate, articulate, passionate, and also extraordinary. I mean, so many Ukrainians say to me, "That wasn't too emotional, was it?" After we recorded, that didn't come across as too emotional. Because of course, they're worried that's a lot of the Western media and so on label them as such. But Ukrainians seem to me some of the most rational and able to strategize and rationalize despite living the most horrific reality. I mean, that's an extraordinary strength, which I'm completely in awe of. And when I do these interviews, I feel extremely humbled to be able to speak to those people. And then there are people who just, because of their enormous sort of gravitas, the fact that they have very interesting perspectives, are a thrill. So people like Keir Giles, Aristotelievich, Mark Galliotti is again endlessly interesting to speak to, especially sometimes when you don't necessarily agree, or you listen to something and you think, that doesn't fit into my mental picture of what's going on. And then you have to try and assess it and say, okay, well, maybe, are they wrong, or is it me? I'm not an expert, so maybe I'm wrong. And you have to kind of rearrange the whole puzzle, rework the whole picture. So I tend to sort of like those a lot. I mean, there's not a conversation that I haven't enjoyed. So I've got to say that as well. But occasionally, one or two I like. And there's only one or two that have not ended up being published. But generally speaking, usually I'm pleasantly surprised by the passion and articulate talents people have when they're asked the right questions. And I don't try to create a competitive environment. I think it's the other thing. A lot of people don't perform well in the media because also immediately it's like, you haven't got long. I'm going to ask you a bunch of questions which perhaps aren't the best questions. You might have heard these questions 24 times before. And I'm also going to ask them in a way that sort of puts you on the spot, makes you feel a little uncomfortable. because that's how you're supposed to be as a journalist, apparently. Although some of the best don't do that at all. And I just it just doesn't get the best out of people. It doesn't get the best information out of them either.
You basically answered my second question, which was, do you enjoy having or running your channel? Why it's important to me? Because I want to understand, in the end of the day, when you lie down in the bed before going to sleep, do you feel satisfied from what you're doing?
Yeah, I mean, if a day goes by and I haven't published a video, I feel rather bad and lazy and guilty, actually. But no, I do enjoy them all. I make sure that I have conversations that I enjoy. Now, they may not necessarily perform that well in the algorithm because I'm not thinking, how do I craft this narrative, to fit in with some sort of publishing identity? I'm not sort of pushing the guests into a certain sort of, I'm thinking of sort of a mincer, like in the Wall album. I'm having conversations because I enjoy them, and I'm trying to label those conversations in a way that is accurate to the conversations, that people aren't come to and go, oh, hang on a second, the thumbnail said this, and I'm seeing something completely different here. That does mean that consistently, some of the conversations don't perform nearly as well as they would do if I've gone after a certain type of guest or repeated certain conversations I've already had. That would work much better in terms of YouTube. And some of the audience would still appreciate it. Or if I put really clickbaity headlines on. But that comes, I think, at the cost of authority and so on. So it's kind of growing in its own way, and in a fairly healthy way. But I'm trying to still make sure I'm getting a lot out of every single conversation, and that's the way I think the audience hopefully will still be there for the journey. The minute I try to fit in with someone else's agenda, I think you can very easily kill the process and kill the audience engagement as well.
Yeah, I guess the reason I ask this question is because, for example, I don't, and I'm honest, I don't feel satisfied from running my channel because I was in 2018, 2019 until 2022, because back in those days I ran my channel in Ukrainian and I was making blogs about my brigade. I was talking about my guys. I would go to the front line, make footage, make interviews with the boys and the girls as well, of course, and show them to their parents on my channel, on my Facebook, and I felt satisfied. But since 2022, every single day when I wake up, my day starts with, reading the news on how many Ukrainian children died due to the drone attacks, how many people died in Kharkiv or in Kiev. And when it's in Kiev, of course, I'm watching the footage from the area because I recognize a lot. And then when I make this video and publish it, I don't feel like I'm doing what I like. This is something that I'm obliged to do. And the only thing that keeps me running is basically those 451 amazing people in the chat, because I realized that conversation is something that always motivates and inspires me. And for example, today is 31st of March. Exactly 3 years ago, and we also talked about it with you today, exactly 3 years ago, my dear friends, Russians withdrew from Bucha. And 2 days from now, 3 years ago, I would go to Bucha with CBS journalists and show them the trench full of bodies. And there were men, there were women, there were children, there were some pretty small bodies wrapped in like bed spreads. And I would see that for the first time. Of course, journalists were speechless because they didn't know how to react, because you don't expect to see that in the 21st century in Europe, but this is what we saw. And of course, you're trying to remain calm and everything else. But over time, when a fucking pussy, I'm sorry for my French, but fucking pussy J.D. Vance says that it was a propaganda tour, he's so lucky that we don't share the same continent at this moment. So after that, when I go to bed, I am happy that I survived and remained a sane person. But generally speaking, this audience that I have on my channel and share like with your channel big time, we have the same audience pretty much. I'm so happy that I have those people who support me psychologically, mentally. This is why I understand that this is something that I have to do. And I think that we should always find motivation in things that we don't like, that we don't consider something that we should like dedicate our life to, but we should always find something motivational, because I understand that, for example, my channel, what I do on my channel by informing people and telling them about the propaganda, it's something important, and people will be grateful for this as much as I am grateful to those people. Speaking of your channel, I know that you created some kind of platform for content creators. We talked about it the other day. Can you talk a bit more about that?
Yes, I mean this is more challenging, getting a community of people to do stuff, and it's given rise to a couple of different formats, but it hasn't grown in quite the way I'd hoped, and I think that's one of the interesting challenges we're going to come to. But I think the concept is a good one, and that is, how do you inspire a bunch of people who may be active on X or X Spaces, Twitter Spaces, or they may be active on LinkedIn and so on? How do you start to get them to create content on other platforms and formats? How do you share some of the techniques and skills which we've learned along the way to grow YouTube channels? How can you actually help people to bring their visions to a bigger audience? And then how can you leverage the presence that we've already got in order to build that kind of faster? So I think that's a great concept, but it hasn't worked perfectly yet, and it hasn't sort of grown in the anticipated way. So I think there are some learnings there for anyone who, and I know this is what you're going to come to, for anyone who is minded to try and say, okay, we need more people in this fight. We need battalions of people to inhabit this information ecosystem. I'm not necessarily sort of debating people who are contrarians or who have the different points of view to me or who are spouting Russian propaganda, but actually there's a space in the ecosystem for people who are prepared to do that. How can we enable other people? So, this site was called the Information Warfare Initiative. It's still sort of going on. We're still going to try and add new voices and people to it. But I think there are other parts of this information ecosystem that need to be explored.
That is exciting for people who either have smaller channels and try to reach to more audience, or want to participate in the fight for truth, I believe. And I think that I will also add the link to this initiative in the description to this channel. But, I think, and I think that you will agree with me, that this informational warfare initiative actually has a big future, because, and at this moment we gotta make our little announcement, the Propaganda Study Institute and the big team of people, including my friend Jonathan, including a lot of bloggers that you, my dear friends, know, decided to start the school that we call Freedom Forge. And you can find the link in the description to this initiative. basically, what is it about? So the content creators that you, my dear friends, are, I have no doubt about it, mostly subscribed to, and we're talking about Anna from Ukraine and also Silicon Curtain and many, many others, Your Body, Artur Rehi, and a lot. Okay, a lot. You will see them yourself. So we decided to start this initiative and basically help people who want to become content creators to create their platforms. We want to share our experience and we want to help you start creating. We are not talking specifically about the fighting, combating Russian disinformation. It's your platform, it's your content, it's your creativity, it's your fantasy. Basically, you can do what you like. So if you want to participate, it's absolutely free. Nobody is funding this stuff. It's literally our initiative, initiative of absolutely amazing people like Jonathan here, for example. It's a free initiative. So guys, you can apply and we will help you with whatever experience we have, how to create your platforms, how to check information, how to use all scenes. If you are into this, field. So please apply, please share this among the people who want to participate, who want to create. If you know some friends, regardless of their age, regardless of anything, who want to become content creators, please send them this link that you can find in the description. Jonathan, I have a question for you. So we know the fact that Russian propaganda is extremely, extremely powerful, and Russian disinformation is literally unstoppable. It's like there are two things that can spread like immediately around the world. One of them is Russian disinformation. But is there any weak spot? Is there any flaw that we can exploit in order to destroy Russian disinformation and make it less effective?
Yes, I think there is. And, we were in some ways far more resilient during the Cold War. One, because their propaganda was far more ideological. But secondly, because we had a stronger belief, I think, in our own values and in the efficacy of democracy and democratic values. So, one of the things that Russian disinformation relies on to sow division is a sense of nihilism, a sense of despair, a sense of almost embarrassment and loathing of our own values and institutions. I think being critical of ourselves is very different from self loathing. And Russian propaganda really requires an element of that, requires an element of society to turn in on itself and on other groups within it. So the greatest strength against Russian propaganda aren't, lies or aggression we can show back to them. It's actually focusing on our own values, reinforcing them, improving them, refining them. Ultimately, I think it's telling better stories than Russian propaganda can tell, because ultimately their stories are, predictable in a way. Their stories are repetitive. Their stories are toxic and boring and don't hold up to the full glare of, sunlight, which is sort of if you let the truth in. So we can beat this stuff, but only if we're not attacking each other, only if we're not divided amongst ourselves. And it seems to me why the initiative you described there is super important. It's because this autocratic playbook that they've developed is not going to go away. Weaponized information is not going to go away. In fact, it's going to become exponential with the rise of AI. So there's no way to sort of fight bad information with more bad information. We have to develop our own sort of tools or revert back to ones that have worked for us in the past. And this isn't something a government can legislate for. This is only things that individuals can do. Go and fight their corner, fight their bit, tackle disinformation in all its guises. As you say, it doesn't need to be Russian disinformation. It can be tackling disinformation within your own political systems, holding people to account, ensuring that values sort of still matter, and that people that infringe them need to resign from positions of responsibility. And I think that is one way we can fight back. And Russia doesn't have an answer for that. Meeting nihilism with strongly held beliefs and values is the way to do it.
I completely agree with you. And considering the fact that Russian disinformation, basically Russian propaganda in general, never produces anything good, anything positive, and it's only aimed at demotivating people. I believe that Russian propaganda is extremely situational, right? It's not strategic, it's tactical. And when we're talking about helping people learn how to create and inspire them to create, this is strategical because we are planting the seed that will grow into a value and create a lot of people that will fill the informational space with their content. And this is something amazing, something I'm really looking for. So again, my dear friends, don't hesitate to check out that link if you feel like starting your own channel. And recent poll, as far as I remember, on my channel in my community posts, indicated that 1/4 of all the respondents decided that they see themselves as creators. If they receive proper training and experience, they can do that. So guys, you gotta try, definitely. One thing that will definitely benefit you guys if you become a content creator, of course, you can grow your channel and you can have a monetization, which probably will not be like extremely huge money, but at the same time, completely enough to pay for your bills or at least for like fuel for your car. I think so. It's also not a bad option to have, right?
Especially with the price of eggs being so high in the US, they'll get you a
Yeah.
few more eggs. Yeah.
I am extremely happy to see, by the way, your channel growing, because I remember when we only met and had our first interview, how many subscribers were there in like 2023?
So I mean, I hadn't quite hit 10,000. I think that happened after almost just under a year of running the channel. And then fast forward a year, and already it's up to 100,000. Now it's at just past 150. So it seemed a long time where it wasn't really sort of going too many places. Um, and it was the conversations that I started having with you and with Anna and with Vlad Vexler actually that really grew the channel. Vlad was also incredibly generous and gave me advice on how to sort of redesign the thumbnails, and he incredibly generous with what had worked for him and giving insights. And that helped it get onto the next sort of stage of evolution. In turn, I think it's important to share those insights. So when Sergei Sumlini started developing his channel, I tried to share everything I'd learned with him and his team, and there's been quite a few instances of that. So I think you and Anna and Vlad especially, I think there's a generosity in the community here, which there's no individual benefit to it. But there is this sense that it really helps the group and it helps individual creators who have strong ideas. And I think that's something else to foster as part of the idea. We're not jealously guarding our little corners of YouTube. No, we'll try and share with people everything we've learned. And if they apply these techniques to excellent original content, then hopefully it becomes a fairly controllable process. Growing your channel.
Yeah, and this is the standpoint that everybody should have, like, don't give me fish, give me the fishing rod. I mean, dear friends, if you have sushi, of course, I don't mind, but you know what I'm saying. Um, okay, I think it's a good opportunity to check out some questions. What countries censor YouTube now? I believe, did China censor YouTube?
I suspect it does. I'm sure you won't get the same results on Tiananmen than you do here. If indeed YouTube is a popular platform, I don't know if it's actually a popular platform in China or not. Certainly, Google doesn't run in mainland China and hasn't done for some time.
So to answer your question, China banned YouTube since 2009. It was replaced by
There
a
we go.
domestic platform, Bilibili and Yoku. North Korea, of course, completely restricted. Iran also officially banned, but some Iranian VPN services allow to access it. And also in Turkmenistan, which is interesting, YouTube is mostly inaccessible. At the same time, in Russia, we know that the speed is throttled and it's very, very hard to use right now. Not if you are working with the Russian bot farm, of course, or Russian intelligence, but if you're a Russian citizen, then you will have this problem. Turkey has temporarily blocked YouTube multiple times in the past due to the political content. In Pakistan, YouTube has been blocked multiple times for hosting blasphemous content, which I think my channel would be completely removed from Pakistani traffic. In Eritrea, the government also restricts internet access, which is so severely done so that few people can use YouTube at all. Probably if you have like a Starlink, maybe not. United Arab Emirates and Saudi Arabia, surprisingly, while not completely ban YouTube, but certain videos, particularly those that criticize the government, are blocked. And then we have Egypt that also temporarily blocked YouTube in the past due to different controversial videos. Due to controversial videos, they would block YouTube in the country. Then Sri Lanka, also during political unrests, and Sudan during political crisis, they also blocked the access to YouTube. Okay, we have an interesting question from Sam Day. What about the downward slide of truth from following the government line to propaganda, and how distorting or dissolving the truth leads to corruption, crime, and paranoia?
That's a complex question, isn't it? I guess it's going to be different in different places. I'm not sure it helps to talk about sort of criminality and government propaganda. I'm not sure, where those are linked. In Russia, they're linked simply because you have the state becoming a criminal entity and then colluding with criminal entities to make money, exert power, and so on. That's not necessarily the dynamic in all authoritarian societies, and it's not necessarily the slide that's going to be taken in all. In America, you see certainly corporatism and oligarchy being defining features, which I think, that form of intense nepotism is a massive form of corruption, but it might be technically legal. It might not actually be infringing any laws, and it might not mean, greater criminality in terms of street crime and so on. So I think that question needs to be applied to specific places and the nuances of different societies and processes, because you can't say that Slovakia and Hungary exactly have the same authoritarianism, and it's not the same as Turkey's semi, let's say, quasi democracy, and it's not the same as Belarus, and Russia isn't exactly the same as Belarus. It's complicated. And Georgia Dream, as another Russian puppet party, has some of the elements of regime criminality, and of course they use informal elements called titushki to beat up and intimidate opponents. But Russia doesn't need Titushki because it has whatever they're called these days, OMON or Rosgvardia or whatever.
Rosgvardia, yeah.
Yeah.
Rosgvardia was basically a very low quality clone of National Guard of Ukraine. But returning to this question, I believe that one of the best ways to oppose this shift from following your government to dissolving your consciousness in the propaganda, I believe that the best way is supporting and maintaining independent media, independent speakers in your country, because there are no independent media in Russia as of this point. You mentioned that Kukly show on the Russian television. I don't see that or similar show on the Russian television nowadays. It would be completely impossible to portray Putin.
No.
That would be dangerous.
Well, that was one of the first things he did when he came to power, was to shut that down. In fact, people will often focus on his forced acquisition of the NTV network and, co-opting the oligarch who owned it, Kuczynski. They would say that that was done to control the news output. And of course it was, because you can't have a sort of independent investigative journalists going and doing whatever they want in a dictatorship. But the real reason why it was an absolute imperative for Putin to take over NTV was to shut down satirical programming. Because ultimately, journalists you can deal with over time. Satirists, you won't even get your autocracy started if you tolerate satire. This, for me, is going to be an absolute litmus test in the US. If they start persecuting satire, if they start political pressure against cartoonists and so on, or if they force the acquisition of mainstream media by compliant oligarchs in order to start shutting down mockery of the regime, then you can say that this slide to authoritarianism is well underway.
I agree on that. There is no better way than fighting dictatorship with satire and humor. I believe Ukrainians and our British brothers and sisters can confirm. We have another question from Just Me Hello. Do you think Trump/Elon have taken the USAID money out to invest in Russian stocks through Bitcoin without the US knowing?
No. I mean, what Russian stocks? Bitcoin certainly has a purpose, and the involvement of Saudi Arabia is interesting, to put it mildly. But stock, I mean, they do it on certain projects, and because Trump understands, real estate and partly understands, extraction industries. Then surely it would be schemes involving those fairly simplistic elements of the economy. No, I doubt whether they're going to be investing in, high-tech enterprises or anything in the value-added sector of the economy, because it's more complex, it's more difficult to control, it's less difficult to predict, it's outside of their sort of, I think, understanding of the economic machine. And who wants to invest in those in Russia right now? I mean, you're not going to make any money off standard companies.
That's the thing. The thing is that it's not about investing Bitcoin in Russia. It's about Russia investing into people in the United States. That's the thing, because cryptocurrency you cannot trace. And whoever funds, for example, big oligarchs in the United States, people like Donald Trump, for instance, right? You cannot trace it because it's completely untraceable. Why Turkey? Question from Dmitry Zorkin. Why Turkey doesn't afraid of Russia, and Trump, with all his air power, does?
That's an interesting one. What's your thoughts on that one? I need to formulate my ideas a little bit around that.
My thoughts are following. Turkey is known for having some of the biggest armies within NATO. And for example, what was explained to me by a Turkish person was that whenever there is some kind of situation in the country or in the neighboring country, the military command has right to, again, maybe I was bullshitted by, but the military command has right to use force to stabilize the situation in the country, relying on something like 1 million troops that they can easily deploy at any time. So that is why they don't really care what is Russian army versus 1 million Turkish troops with their advanced technologies,
Yeah.
drones, and basically whole NATO support. Turkey dictates Russia which ships can pass to and from Black Sea and which ships cannot. Turkey doesn't care because Turkey has balls, basically, and balls is the foundation of being able to say no to dictators and tyrants. In my personal opinion,
Yeah.
Turkish
Doesn't
people,
trigger World War Three either. Do you see World War Three happening between Russia and Turkey? No, it doesn't,
yeah,
and it's not even a thing because they show strength. They show they can bite back. Um, that's where, and it's not just sort of Biden that fell for this, sort of coercive manipulation or reflexive control. There are elements in the Trump team who are absolutely parroting the same blah blah blah, World War Three, blah blah blah, nuclear this, nuclear that. Just look at how Turkey handles it. There's your template for how to deal with bullshit tyrants.
absolutely. Let's talk about Gopniks, okay? A widespread culture that emerged in Russia, which has its roots in prison. Gopniks are those street scum that literally mugs people, right? Taking their phones and stuff. How do they do that? They never attack and rob you. They just approach you and say, "Hey, dude, do you have money?" And like whatever your answer is, they will talk you into giving them money. And when they see that you are kind of showing the signs of being afraid of them, they will use the fear against you and they will take whatever you have. And if you refuse, and if they see using their speech as a probe, to check your weak spots, if they see that you are a weak person that cannot confirm its status with like two fists, they will mug you and they will beat you up basically for fun. Um, if you punch back and crush this dude's nose, hit him several times, he understands that no, better not have business with you because you can fight back. Okay, and they will keep their distance from you and they will never touch you again. This is how you deal with Russians, no matter if it's like a tiny Gopnik on the street or a big oligarch. They only understand the language of violence, unfortunately. Why unfortunately is because us Europeans, people on the West, this is not how we are raised. When you are punched in the school, usually there's like a whole commission gathers talking about how to deal with this conflict, how to make sure that the boys don't fight anymore, how to explain them that violence is bad, that we should act together. And in my opinion, this is proper thing. Like, our kids should not solve their problems through violence. But the problem is because we have such neighbors as Russia, as North Korea. Unfortunately, we have to have some guys who can defend democracy with fists and weapons. And this is reality. In Russian school, if you are punched and you return home with a black eye, your mother say that you suck because you didn't punch back. And it doesn't matter. There's nothing like in Europe. There's nothing like in the United States. You will be blamed for being a pussy. Sorry, like I'm calling things for what they are. You will be blamed for being weak. Because in Russia they don't respect you if you're weak. Girls don't date you. You cannot impress a lady having deep internal cosmos or whatever, широкая русская душа. No, you must have like some testosterone inside yourself. You gotta be like a violent dude. If you produce violence, then you're great guy. If not, you suck. This is how they build their whole society. This is how they retransmit violence from the tops and to the bottoms and further to other countries. So I hope it answers your question. Turkey has balls. Turkish people have balls. They know how to defend what's theirs, and they know how to defend their position, which we can also see from what's happening on the streets in Turkey right now, because they have balls. And we also had a similar situation in 2014. So
this is the bit that people don't understand, I think. This is the endless bit coming back to Maidan and CIA coup and blah, 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 blah. Yanukovych was hollowing out the state, hollowing out the army, the ability of the state to offer any resistance to Russian imperialism gradually was being eroded bit by bit by bit. I wasn't there. This is what I'm taking from the interviews that I do. But I know you were there and can attest to this. It's this idea that the slide to autocracy isn't a single moment. It's not a Marvel comic book kind of heroes and villains thing, but it's a gradual degradation of institutions, of processes, of the culture and practice of law. It's the introduction of oligarchic influence and dirty money that sort of corrupts, and turning institutions, not disbanding them, but turning them into sort of zombie versions of themselves that have no authenticity. Well, at some point you have to decide that that's gone too far, and you've gone beyond simply a bad administration, and you are now on an authoritarian slide. And I think it's understanding that process. And what I find wonderful and extraordinary is how many Ukrainians must have simultaneously understood that this is what's happening, and it shall not go further, it shall not pass. To have on such a mass level that extraordinary appreciation of what's going on in society, this I think is the lesson that the rest of the Western world needs to learn. If we're going to preserve our democracy, we have to have mass participation in politics and mass awareness of what's happening, and indeed the sort of internal structures and architecture of our systems, so that we understand when they're under threat. That's the bit I certainly worry about, because there are many, many people who do not understand in Britain, our checks and balances, the role of the legislature versus the judiciary, and how, let's say, elements of the judiciary do have the ability to hold the executive to account, as well as the legislature, although that's increasingly not so good at doing that. Unless we understand our systems and are minded to improve them, this is going to be quite a difficult fight. So if there are any creators out there who want to cover very boring topics about constitutional affairs and party politics, there's always more room for that stuff.
Yeah. We have another question. Is it true that Putin is mobilizing and arresting some oligarchs? From what I remember, correct me if I'm wrong, Jonathan, but I think that arresting oligarchs in Russia is done through like open window.
Yes, it's the not quite the Fortushka method, but it's yeah. I was always told by grandmothers that what they call it, drafts or skviznyaki, are very dangerous. Well, it seems that being near any open window is incredibly dangerous in Balochistan. But there is a story of an oligarch at the moment who is under some kind of process. And that's not because he's corrupt. They're all corrupt. So if someone suddenly gets prosecuted for something, then it's a political choice. It's not it's not a judicial choice. That may just be the result of these struggles that are taking place as resources become fewer, and Putin requires a group of loyalists. So I think you're seeing a process of resources being taken away from one set of people. That may even go up to the oligarch level. That doesn't mean oligarchy is being abolished. It just means that, well, at this point in time, you need people who are more loyal, who are more willing to inflict violence and trauma to help support your regime. So we may well be seeing a transition of the assets and resources of the state away from people who perhaps Putin might feel he cannot rely on quite so much, and more towards the more sort of dedicated slash thuggish elements. So a redistribution. This is certainly not a systemic change.
I agree. Plus, let's analyze this from a standpoint of a Russian person, right? Russians want to live good, okay, especially Russian oligarchs. Putin also wants to live good. And that is why one of the reasons why
Just
he
wants to
doesn't.
live longer, I think, at this point.
Yeah, but at the same time, do you really think that Putin wants to see, for example, Moscow obliterated in nuclear fire? No.
Of course not. Of course
Of
not.
course,
No.
no. Russian oligarchs also want to live good, but they don't have this opportunity right now to, for example, travel to their villas in like Malta or Rio de Janeiro or like in Florida, Miami. They cannot do that physically right now because a lot of them are sanctioned. And of course, it doesn't make them happier. 3 years in a row instead of like going to Salerno for a vacation, Russian oligarchs have to go to a freaking Ust-Pizdusk, which is not the best place to spend your vacation. And they are mad, they are angry, they cannot use a lot of their frozen assets that are frozen beyond the border. So this makes a lot of them mad, and some of those that are the most mad, right? Some of the most dangerous. We can find their last names in that absolutely amazing list of people that mysteriously died since 2022 due to different situations, mysterious and unexplainable. We have another question. And this one is interesting. A question for the guest. Why is the UK collapsing lately? Do you think that this is even a case?
It's not collapsing. I think that's the interesting point about it is it's certainly taken a bit of a beating, a bit of a knock, but it has shown a certain level of resilience in society, a certain level of resilience in institutions. Remember, Boris Johnson, for whatever he did for Ukraine, when I think that's broadly positive, and he was the right person at the right time and made some critical leadership decisions vis-a-vis Ukraine. Prior to that, he wasn't exactly known for making the best decisions, it has to be said. And certainly under his premiership, there was a certain willingness to play fast and loose with the law, bend the law, and there was quite a bit of confrontation between those very checks and balances, which are an essential part of our system. And he certainly seemed to want to override some of them. I think part of his legacy also in subsequent premiers was an attempt to try and muzzle the right of protest, the right of free assembly. So we do have some challenges, and our checks and balances, like every democracy, are under threat. But it doesn't mean they're being abolished. It doesn't mean they're not going to sort of fight back. We don't have a certain resilience. It seems to me that there was a lot of internal resistance in his own party to what Johnson was doing and to Brexit. We had turmoil. But in hindsight, actually, that turmoil is quite refreshing, because what we're not seeing is the sort of GOP in the US, almost to a man and woman, lining up to agree with absolute madness, to trade policies that are lunacy, to deal with the ravings of a sort of bloated orange sociopathic toddler and rubber stamping every decision. we didn't have a system that did that. Our system kind of fell apart when the craziest decisions were trying to be foisted onto us, and that I think shows that there's some life still. And Brexit is extremely damaging, but we have the ability to get rid of particular administrations when they fail epically. I think that's the essence of democracy: is not who you elect, but whether you can kick out the guys that you're already fed up with. And we've shown that our system is still very, very good at that. It doesn't fall apart every time there's an election and change in leadership. We have certain consistency within the administrators and the civil service. They keep an incredibly tight ship. I've heard Russians who marvel at that system. Having experienced a few elections, they go like, "How does this happen? How does it happen that one day you've got this guy, right, and then he loses an election or she loses an election, the movers turn up, everything's gone, they're out, the new person's in, and it's almost as if nothing's happened. You don't." So I wouldn't characterise Britain as fundamentally broken. But there's a lot of stuff that requires improvement, and there are threats as well. Some people won't support this, and fair enough. But I happen to see Farage as very similar to some of those sort of Kremlin puppets in other countries. And they might say, but hang on a second, how dare you say that? Well, Georgia Dream in Georgia, for the first two periods it was elected, its first two administrations, was not overtly siding on every issue with Moscow. They were biding their time until the point where it looked like they were going to lose, and then they started really coercing the system to ensure that they never lost. But for two administrations, they created a rather good, I would say, illusion of plurality, illusion of being a normal political party. So again, the trick is not who you elect. It's can you kick the little tossers out when the time comes.
Yeah, I agree on that, because there are specific people trained to make you guys elect proper people. So it really not who you elect. But we have a question from Katharina, who asks, what about the claim that Brexit was orchestrated by Kremlin? Do you believe that this is the case?
To say that would be to say there was no sort of organic process at work, and that is clearly not true. Now, prior to the big sort of Brexit debate, etc., you could have polled, in fact, polls were done about how important some of these issues that became important in Brexit were. How important is the EU? How intrusive is it in your life? How important is this concept of sovereignty, etc.? Prior to the referendum, these things came very low down most people's list of priorities. Very, very low down. So certainly there was an extraordinary sort of weaponization of that process. I think it's complex, that weaponization of it. It also came after the recession. We were still in the aftermath of the 2008 major kind of recession and banking crisis. So I think it was a combination of absolute ineptness by the ruling party and Cameron, the way it was held, the way he acquiesced to the extremists in the party, the utterly simplistic and ludicrous structure of the referendum itself, and then the very poor way in which the campaign was run. You can say, well, none of these things, Russia didn't do any of those things, and they absolutely didn't. And I know Swiss people look at it and go like, you're barking mad, because the Swiss would never have a referendum structured in that way. And if you're going to do something on such an element of criticality, you want a sort of a reasonable threshold. Now, you've got to get 60%, 70, 75% to fundamentally change the country's entire business model. You would also have a cooling off period, and then a second referendum where you would perhaps then give more detailed options, but have a simple yes or no binary option on something of a critical importance to the economy and indeed the entire, I would say, strategic underpinning of how we do business was utter insanity. And of course, it turned into something of a protest vote against the incumbent government. So in every sense, it was absolutely ineptly carried out. And then the campaign was absolutely piss poor. But you can also point to the figure of Boris Johnson, who was critical over decades of running, before clickbait was even a thing, he was running clickbait stories about how the EU wanted to ruin everyone's lives and dominate and control everyone. So there was a grift in that. Clearly, there was a grift. There was a sense that you can gain power and notoriety and work your way up the political ladder. Now, of course, Russia loves to use those people. Was Johnson used in such a manner or not? I don't know. Perhaps it's almost immaterial because this was a grift that he was absolutely master at. So he created a fertile ground for the vote to go that way. And then, of course, when he swung behind it, that was another significant step. You could say there were a lot of people behind Farage, a lot of people behind the Leave campaign with extremely dubious sources of money. So I think history will probably show that there was a lot of petrol poured on the flames by Russia. The result undoubtedly was a strategic triumph for Russia, in that never in their wildest dreams would they be able to peel off Britain from the EU and create such division within the Western alliance, which it clearly did. And I think even the Americans, who were still sane at that point, were looking at us thinking that Britain's absolutely lost its mind, that there's no economic rationality behind this decision at all. What saved us? Well, to an extent, COVID came along, and that was a bigger thing. And then Russia's, endless wars and the full-scale war came along. And I think these things have sought to reunite Britons on a common topic. And I know people watching this, I know people who watch my channel will not agree with me at all on Brexit, will not agree with me at all on figures like Farage. But we find commonality in other aspects. We find commonality in talking about freedom, innovation, and Russia and these slides to authoritarianism. So I think in his extremism, both Putin and Trump have shown, at least most Britons, that they have far more in common than what divides them.
Yeah, we have a good commentary from Cheryl. I was surprised by how much Maga hates the European Union. I smell Orban. Absolutely, absolutely, and not only European Union. They basically hate everyone. This community is basically built on hatred and toxicity, and I don't see anything beautiful or constructive coming from it. Unfortunately, I'm sorry. I had opportunity to talk to several guys from that community of people. No. We have another one. Curious, would it be possible to even have a talk between someone like Jonathan and Dugin or Gherkin, or are they totally madcap on your
I
channel?
can answer that very clearly. I would not speak to Dugin because he's not even he's not a philosopher. He's not intellectually coherent, even in his own arguments. I don't think there'd be any value in speaking to him or to Gherkin. Is more interesting because, I can't remember his name. The guy whose plane accidentally fell out of the sky.
Prigozhin.
Um, Prigozhin, like Prigozhin, occasionally he says things that are interesting, that are challenging. The official line. He doesn't just spew propaganda, but he is a toxic nationalist. He's an international war criminal. So no, I would not. I would not talk to either of them. I don't think there would be anything particularly beneficial in doing that. In fact, with Dugin, quite the opposite. You're giving oxygen to someone who is vile and adds no value. There are, however, figures who could be interesting but would be highly controversial. There are quite a few Russians that I'd be interested in speaking to. I mean, and these not so controversial. So Vladimir Pastukhov would be interesting. Khodorkovsky would definitely be interesting. I would not, I don't think, be interested in speaking to Yulia Navalny, simply because I distrust what she says and what she does, and I find their strategy extremely disingenuous. Not siding with Ukrainian victory is both strategically inept but also morally repulsive. But there are some figures who are quite interesting, who at some point would have been actually part of the regime. I mean, one we've talked about is Alexander Nezvorov, and I know a lot of Ukrainians probably wouldn't want to speak to me again if I interviewed him. But he is a rather fascinating character, and he almost certainly has some interesting things to say that would be extremely enlightening to a Western audience. He can talk about the sheer toxicity and evil behind the regime in a way that few other people actually can. This is definitely not going to happen because I'm not going to Moscow, but another one, of course, is Vladislav Surkov. I mean, that would be extraordinarily fascinating. I mean, as long as you know you're in the presence of evil, as long as you know you're not, as long as, well, you'd have to arm yourself with exceedingly good questions. But you have to ask, what's the benefit? And how can these people manipulate that conversation? And actually, you also have to ask who is behind them. Well, Surkov is the architect, ultimately, of Putin's hybrid autocracy. He's also the architect of the invasion of Crimea. He's been retired for a number of years. I rather fear that he's the architect of what we see unfolding in the US. I have no evidence for that, but I fear that behind the scenes he's been busy sort of building strategies to penetrate the US. That's just the sheer extent and subtlety of it. Has his paw prints all over it. A conversation with him would be fascinating. He'd almost certainly run rings around me, despite the context I have. But there are multiple people who could be quite interesting, but generally they would tend to call themselves opponents of the regime, and most of them would be classed as foreign agents. And of course, I've spoken to some more of the academic type who are very beneficial to speak to and are probably far less controversial. So Andrei Soldatov, for instance, a very good analyst, very, very interesting person to speak about not only the culture of the KGB, but a whole range of matters on how the Russian intelligence services are structured and the culture and conversations happening within them.
I agree on that. JFK mentioned that a true democracy does not fear the arguments of tyrants, which I completely agree with. On the other hand, it's exciting, I think, to dig in the brain of a dictator or two. But on the other hand, when you do that a lot, in the end of the day, it's not different from digging inside a brain of a maniac or a different kind of criminal, a rapist. Basically, it's the same. It's all based on violence, ambitions, complexes. It's a mix of that. That is just my opinion.
Well, cleaning out a mental septic tank, I mean, it's you're wading through some really fetid and disgusting stuff. And I mean, this is what you mentioned earlier. You're doing this day by day. You're talking about the sort of crimes, and I say I get enjoyment out of the videos. I do, because I feel they're having impact, and yours have tremendous impact as well. But at the end of the day, we are concentrating and we are focusing on terribly barbarous acts, which are comparable to some of the worst things to emerge from history. I feel important to do so, and I feel it gives me strength, having studied history before, and that's part of my degree. I feel that I have almost a professional duty to do that and bring that to it. But we have to face that it's almost certainly traumatizing for people to immerse themselves in this scale of evil year after year, day after day, year after year.
I personally don't find such things exciting, because I was a policeman and I had experience of interrogating different people, from criminals on the street to Russian terrorists. that were captured. And it's only exciting when you do that, when you don't do that every day. Okay, when your life is not when it's not part of your job, of your everyday's life, then it is exciting. It's interesting to watch like a YouTube video dedicated to this. You know, how did the brain of Stalin look like after, the forensic expertise and everything else? But when you have this knowledge, doesn't feel exciting at all. It's just a different. I would not mind like interrogating people like Girkin or Dugin, maybe in the future. I hope so. We'll have such a chance, maybe. But
Solovyov, I mean, that would be the.
Solovyov, yeah,
Where would you
yeah.
even start?
Uh, Yeah, but in the end of the day, Solovyov, again, he's a great representative of his own audience. He knows how to talk to his own audience. And if you want to understand Solovyov's audience, look at him, look at his face, look at how he talks with despise towards other nations, towards everything that is dear to us, people on the West, people with democratic values. The way he talks, the way he threatens everybody, the way he screams, that is basically his main audience. That is why his channel is so extremely popular and like tops the ratings on the Russian national television. We have another one. Starsky, do you have a German language channel? No, I don't, because my German still sucks, but I'm working on it. And will you give the benefit of the doubt to Trump about being pissed off with Putin and help Ukraine this time? How do you think?
There's no evidence. There's no evidence that he has helped Ukraine at all, ever. And for those people who are saying, "Oh, but what about the javelins and stuff?" This stuff was already in process. He didn't initiate it, but he didn't stand in the way of it. No, he's never done anything overtly initiated by him that would benefit Ukraine and disbenefit Russia. There's no evidence of these actions having taken place ever. And as we discussed earlier, he was the instrument of denying aid to Ukraine. Even though he was in opposition, his influence over the GOP and processes was such that he was able to get Ukraine aid blocked for 6 months, which in reality caused a sort of 8-month dearth of ammunition and shells. Let's not forget that literally thousands upon thousands upon thousands of Ukrainian servicemen and women died, as well as civilians, in that period, as well as the opportunity to push Russia back, push their invasion back. Opportunity and time was lost. He did that. He did that.
Yeah.
He has nothing but either indifference at best, malice at worst towards Ukraine, and he has a curious, almost inexplicable obsession and obsequiousness towards Russia and Putin. I think he is the apprentice of Putin. He is an apprentice to dictators and tyrants. He admires them, but there's something else going on there. However, one explains it. No, this is all smoke and mirrors. This is all a theatrical pantomime to keep the media busy, to keep everyone busy, even to keep analysts and historians busy. I won't name the name, but I've just brought up an article written and published in the last, written probably today, published in the last few minutes, and it's by a highly reputable historian, one who actually I've spoken to, and he does some fantastic work. But this is a particularly awful article, and it just says, Putin has pushed Trump too far. This is the trick. This is the very trick. When Trump is suspected of being too Putin friendly, it's not great within his party. It's not great for his standing, actually, within his base, to be seen as the poodle of an autocrat. So what do? You do something to throw people off the scent. Naughty boy, Putin, I'm very upset with you. If he actually slaps secondary sanctions on, then I'll take my words back. But I'm not expecting any tangible actions to come from this. And I expect the Russian propagandists and even Putin will just say, you know what, this is what he has to say. That's internal domestic stuff. Don't don't sweat it.
My friend, I said this so many times before then that if Trump helps Ukraine and provides us with all the necessary equipment and help us to win the war, to restore our borders and everything else, I will wear a red hat for the rest of my life. You cannot cut
Yeah,
these words out of my video because,
not going to happen though. How does it
but
benefit him? You know, a Ukrainian triumph helps the rule of law. A Ukrainian triumph helps the international order. It helps the consolidation of Europe behind a system of values. It helps the EU by bringing in one of the most sort of powerful and values-led country in the bloc, which is Ukraine. How does any of this help Trump? This isn't his agenda. He's shown no interest in institutional resilience, in democracy, in the international order. No, his aim is to tear it all down.
yeah, he doesn't have strategy. He doesn't have understanding of what kind of goals and what kind of benefits the U.S. will have in case Russia collapses, in case Russia loses the war.
This is even worse. No, I mean, yes, exactly. An article I've just been looking at while we were talking hints that there is a Pentagon document. I don't know whether it has its origins pre-Trump or whether it's recent. It basically states that the US will not come to the aid of Europe if it is attacked by Russia. That could be the Baltics, could be Moldova, could be anywhere. US will stand by and let it happen because they're far more concerned about China, apparently. Although that seems to me there's some smoke and mirrors going on there as well. I don't know how genuinely concerned they are about China or whether there are some benefits to be had there. But no, this isn't what he's about at all. So, whereas he doesn't have a plan and a strategy, he does have instincts. And his instinct is to lash out and try to weaken anything that looks or smells like it might be a kind of institutional impediment or barrier to his behavior. In that sense, he is like two peas in a pod with Vladimir Vladimirovich.
Yeah, I agree. Okay, a couple more questions here because soon it will be midnight actually in the United
It
Kingdom.
will
Oh my
be.
God,
It will. Yes,
I'm exploiting Jonathan as much as I can tonight. Where can I buy a cool hoodie like the one you're wearing now? So, dear Kirk, if you go and check out that link in the description, the link of our Propaganda Study Institute, there is this tab called merch, and there you can find hoodie and all sorts of merch that we have, including notebooks and cups like mugs and stuff. So please check it out. You can find it there. And it's a really good quality, by the way. Does anyone follow Kaylan? Kaylan Robertson. If you don't follow Kaylan Robertson, you really should, because
yes.
what he does is a perfect journalism. He's a pro, basically. He's young and he has extremely good vision and feeling of the story and the way to tell the story and create a video. Please check him out, Kaylan Robertson, on YouTube. Currently, he is roaming around Donbass. Please check him out and subscribe. It's worth it. Definitely worth it.
He's quite a character as well. In real life, he's one of the biggest personalities I've ever met. He's I think you describe him as a bit of a nutter, I think, in English phraseology, but in a good way.
Yeah, there's a lot of nutters wherever you go. So Caitlin T asks, Jonathan, what do you think about creating media foundations as opposed to media companies? The purpose would be to increase the importance of ethics as opposed to profits.
That's very interesting because I started grappling with that very question as well. And it seems to me that once you start creating a media company, it's not just about sort of profit, it's also about having a certain editorial structure, a certain and with that becomes, well, where are we going to be on the left-right political spectrum? Who is our audience? How are we going to get them to tune in? How are we going to tune in to tell them what they want to hear? That's already, to my mind, the wrong way to go about it. I think the loyalty needs to be to certain values and articulate what those values are, as opposed to where you are in a political spectrum or an ideology, and articulate those values clearly, and then judge the world as to whether they are beneficial or detrimental to those values, not the ideological framework. The other bit is that I'm not a journalist or activist, and in fact, my methodology, even though I'm called, people say, "Well done on your journalistic activities," and yet the methodology I use is completely the opposite of everything I see that journalists do and how they're trained, and that's not to disparage that, because of course at its height that produces tremendous work and there are brilliant journalists. And there is some convergence in some ways of the result of what I do with some of the better journalists. My methodology is completely different. And if I was to start turning into more of a traditional media company, I would probably start to need to adopt some of those kind of frameworks and methodologies. And that is why I think there's more freedom to experiment and be aligned with values rather than ideologies and commercial models, as well as models of narrative storytelling, which the media tends to adopt. Does this story fit in with this particular version of reality that we've got? That kind of falls apart when you try to examine something like Russia, which has its own internal logic, which is different very much from the sort of Western media and political logic. So foundations are a great idea, and I think having individual creators. This is the other thing. Do you want sort of journalists who are generalists at what they do, and they use these kind of frameworks to try and get at a sort of reality, but they're coming at a fairly superficial level, or do you want people who are much more like activists? They still need professionalism, they still need ethics, they still need a whole load of things and tools and skills, but is it much better to have people like Kalin and Sabrina Zabrinsky and Phil Ittner, and there are many others, and John Sweeney, who've decided that actually they can't be dedicated to a particular story if they're part of a media structure, and they've sort of struck out on their own. I only really watch people who are dedicated to the particular stories, and they're able to immerse themselves in the story, because otherwise, what they're saying jars and their questions jar, to me at least. So, for instance, I have huge respect for, say, the Telegraph, the latest team, because they broadcast day in, day out, and there comes a sort of contextual knowledge to that, which means their questions are interesting and their way of examining the story is interesting. When it comes to, say, Times Radio, to compare the two formats, that really depends on the journalist. And there's one or two journalists who I'll listen to because I know they're going to have a slightly more interesting and probing, methodology. But actually, many of the journalists might have brilliant guests on, but the quality of the questions is going to be so shallow or even misdirected that you end up not learning anything, even though some of the guests are brilliant. But I'll tend to watch those to find decent guests and then think, okay, well, how could we get more out of them than that particular achieved? Or what I'll also do is, okay, well, they've covered all the basics in that. There's no point in repeating that ground, because I can just refer to that video and say, okay, well, watch that one. If you've liked this one, I'll go and watch that one first and then watch this one. So I kind of make a conscious decision to try and build upon the work of I would say, the more generalist journalists, and do something that's more in depth. I know I've rambled a lot, but I don't know if that helps.
I gotta say, I'm truly inspired by your interviews on your channel. Seriously, because every time I watch you interviewing a guest, I ask myself, how the hell do you come up with such questions? this is something that requires extraordinary, I don't know, either skills or experience. I'm not sure how it works
Well,
myself, though.
given I was a marketeer until for most of my career, I've been a digital marketer, not doing anything even remotely like this. So it's something I've just learned
Yeah.
very rapidly. Yeah.
Yeah. And by the way, speaking of digital marketing, guys, there was a question about Brexit. If you want to learn about the communication component of Brexit, what was involved in terms of social media, in terms of the digital platforms, check out literally the movie with Benedict Cumberbatch called Brexit. And it's so good.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, that's definitely worth watching.
Question from Miles to go. Will Russia's new military mobilization be able to gather up enough donkeys, camels, scooters, and ladas? What do you think of that?
Oh boy. I don't know if you saw that incredible video of someone who was walking around in a wire mesh kind of cage to try and trap the drones.
Ellie sent me that video. I literally I couldn't stop laughing for like 13 minutes.
It was quite something. You can imagine a whole battalion of people in those. It would be hilarious.
You can play Tetris with the.
Yeah, yeah. But they'll all be bumping into each other and falling into trenches and dangling, down. It would be fairly nuts.
Yeah, as a former military, I could not dream more about having a enemy who cannot lie down while advancing, who
Yeah,
cannot
yeah.
like squeeze between two trees or like go through forest. That is
It's a
just
sniper's dream as well, isn't it? All you'd have to do is to put some electric cables down and they just electrocute them all as well.
oh yeah. But
But it's a serious question. I mean, because there is a story out today, isn't it, that what they call the Verbovka has begun again, and they're looking to get a bunch of new people. I think it was 160,000. But the fact remains, they've been able to get 15, 20,000, new bodies monthly throughout this full scale war. So yeah, they'll find people, but they're not necessarily the best people. They're not necessarily trained or skilled in any way.
yeah. We have a very interesting question from Kurt, who asks, will Ukraine be able to destroy enough Russian armor to advance and take back their territory? The question is not even much about the Russian armor, because Russians use armor to deliver their personnel and perform an offensive operation. The biggest problem is Russian defense lines, Russian minefields. How many armored vehicles and tanks does Ukraine have, and other vehicles to deliver personnel to
We just
the
don't
front
know,
lines?
do we?
Yeah, so that is a an interesting one. Ukraine is good at performing raids. For example, raids is what we call something that you could see in Kursk, in Belgorod before Kursk. That is a raid. We had performed several raids in 2014 using our airborne troops, who literally were raiding deep in the rear, along the border, even between the pro-Russian separatists, between the Russian hybrid army and the Russian border. They would literally cut them from Russian supplies this way. Raiding is good, but when we're talking about the offensive operation on a much global scale, we're talking about a front line, and front line must be even. There must be a lot of how to say there must not be any possibility for the enemy to surround your troops, take them into the pot, котел.
The Katul, yes, the
Yeah,
Katul. Yeah.
So it's a much more sophisticated topic than just, having a lot of good guys on like Humvees that could drive all the way to Moscow. No, no. From
No.
strategic standpoint, it doesn't really look like that.
No,
Um,
and they're not without capability. I mean, we've had a lot of reports that Russian drone units, they have created specialist drone units. They have created certain capabilities, especially with the fly-by-wire ones. So this is an extraordinary attritional war where I don't think you're going to get the sudden breakthrough or a technology that's suddenly going to give you that ability to sort of cut through. It's not like the invention of tanks, in the First World War, where suddenly some new capability comes onto the field. Even then, counter tank techniques develop very, very quickly from there. And the depth of the minefields, as we know, is got no parallel in history. So that's not easily overcome. And then what do you do? I mean, Russia is a vast, vast country. Um, it's difficult to know and if there's a strategic objective such as cutting off gas supplies or taking over certain strategic installations, then that's fair enough, but just beyond that, there's no logic in taking Russia. It's just yeah, it's what do you do with endless swamp.
yeah, make friends with all the mosquitoes. Um, so, Ladas, we already discussed this. And the last remark from Alvin Archer, as Churchill said, democracy is the worst form of government until you consider other options.
Yes. I mean, I like some of Churchill. That one is a particularly useful one. The other one is the one about feeding the crocodile. Eventually you run out of other people's countries to feed to it. That, unfortunately, is not a lesson which Trump seems to have heeded yet. It is useful, and to recognise the imperfections of democracy. I think is important because Russian propaganda plays on that endlessly. But the imperfections of democracy, the inefficiencies of it, are nothing compared to the inefficiencies of a tyranny. Because as we started the conversation, tyrants, when they make mistakes, those mistakes are huge and usually, almost impossible to reconcile. And they're incredibly wasteful mistakes, both in terms of resource and life. And yeah, democracy is wasteful. Autocracy is infinitely worse.
Yeah. Guys, you got to look at democracy from the standpoint of communication specialist, okay? Because if you look at democracy from the standpoint of a person who votes, and for example, when your candidate loses, then what is your standpoint? Okay, your standpoint is that all the stupid people voted for this idiot, right? Because there are more stupid people. It's wrong. The idea behind this, like what I see as a communication specialist, is that I see that his team, communications team, was better than your candidate's team. It was stronger, it had better communication strategy, it lied to the voters enough to convince them to vote for this person. And the most important thing about elections is that that team didn't plan to lose. Because when this is how we were raised, we gotta always have like plan B. What if we lose? What do we do now? Forget about plan B. You gotta consider this a competition, right? Imagine this. Imagine that you would elect your leader through a boxing match. And imagine that the opponent is an extremely big guy. Okay, not big guy, but really good boxer. He moves really fast. Okay, he has good reaction. What do? You have to train. This should motivate you to train. Same with your for example, same with the democracy. When your opponent plans his election campaign, he doesn't plan, or she doesn't plan to lose. They plan to win. They don't have plan B. They put all effort into winning. And this must be our strategy as well. We should see them making a plan B. We should see them being destroyed. Because unfortunately, this is something that usually happens to good people only. We are always outmatched in terms of communications. And it must be a good competition. There's a lot of commentaries out there that, Operator Starsky had a good channel until the Democrats bought Operator Starsky. They don't have such money to buy me because I know that their communication unfortunately sucks. And I know how bad it is because they are not dedicated enough to win. And unfortunately, their opponents that we are roasting now in every videos because we cannot do anything else. But unfortunately, their opponents were much better at communications and unfortunately at lying to the voters. And that is the reason why they won. And that is something that should be considered a good lesson to all the communication specialists, not really you, my dear viewers, but the communications team and PR specialists working with the Democrats or any other force, because they lost, they were not dedicated enough. I'm sorry. Deal with this or do something now because this situation is really not really inspiring. And on this positive note, because I hope that it's positive, because whatever challenges we can see in front of ourselves is something that should always motivate us and motivate us to become better than we are and than we were yesterday. So I really, really hope that you liked this conversation, that actually made a record. It's 2 hours 45 minutes on this channel. Didn't happen for a long time, but we have a really, really interesting person sitting here in the UK and talking with us, and a lot of extremely, extremely interesting questions, my dear friends. I think it's a good opportunity to call this a night and say thank you so much. And Jonathan, maybe you have something to say to our dear community.
Just thank you to all the support that you give me, that you give Operator Starsky and all the other fantastic sort of creators. Stay united, don't pick fights, especially when we're on the same side, and give people the space to be different. I think that's one of the biggest challenges here, and I've got a colleague in this fight who's taking a very different strategy than I am. He's experimenting in his own way. Not everything works, and I think we need to give people the space to do those experiments, even if no one knows the outcome of these things. So, be supportive rather than yapping at each other like sort of little puppies or whatever, trying to take chunks out of each other. We've got a common enemy. And I think as long as we're focused on defeating and then containing Russia, then everything else, hopefully we'll get some perspective on everything else.
Yeah, thank you so much, Jonathan. Thank you for participating in this stream. It was extremely insightful, I would say. And as always, I learned a lot from you, and you always serve as my inspiration, considering my YouTube channel and everything else.
Oh, well, that's deeply humbling, because you are, for all of us, the master of this. Yeah. So
no, not really, but thank you so much. And dear friends, thank you for your support. Thank you for subscribing to Jonathan's channel and for to the channels of all other creators supporting Ukraine. This is extremely, extremely important thing. Thank you so much for supporting my channel, keeping my channel running. This is again very important to me. And thank you for supporting my country, supporting my people, and supporting democracy and freedom. One thing that can really help you is, of course, creativity. Think about creating your own channel, your own platform, maybe your own blog in text somewhere on WordPress or Blogspot or anywhere else. Maybe this is something that you will find extremely interesting, and this is something that will help you either relieve yourself or release yourself and release some kind of talent that you keep inside. Think about it. This is extremely important. There's a lot of paid opinion makers and all kinds of toxic people producing garbage every single day and getting paid for that, literally because they don't have anything beautiful inside, or they're paid by totalitarian regimes to literally feed you every day with that garbage. Guys, world is much more beautiful than that. Life is much more precious than that. So think about it. If you think that you can see yourself as a content creator, consider joining our school. You can find the link in the description. Also, big thanks to our moderators. And as always, stay positive, my friends, because Russian disinformation and propaganda can only work against people who consider themselves toxic and dissatisfied with the life. Always look at the bright side of life, and we'll see you in the next one. Be safe.
Слава Україні!
Героям слава!
Смерть ворогам!